Welcome, listeners, to the Sagittarian Fires of 2025. In today's episode, we are delighted to present Kadmus for the second time on the show. Kadmus has developed many of his earlier ideas from his essay Every Necromanteia is a Katabasis into perhaps one of the single greatest texts on the subject of necromancy that I have ever read. This book is not simply a how-to manual, but instead a deep exploration of the subject and dramatis personae of epistemic evocation, or learning from legendary practitioners. Kadmus is a teacher and author focusing on philosophy, myth, politics, and the multivalence of pagan thought. Today, we discuss a huge range of subjects concerning necromancy, the myths of Circe, Medea, and the hermaphrodite Tiresias, Pre-Mycenaean oral mythology, how to build rapport with the shades of the dead, and much more. If you enjoy this sort of conversation on the arts of the occult and esoteric, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We are very grateful for every little thing that you can do to help us grow and reach a wider audience. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am honoured to welcome back Kadmus to the Hadean Press podcast. Kadmus, welcome back to the podcast.
It's so nice to be back, Matt. Thank you so much for having me back on.
For our listeners who didn't catch you in our previous interview, could you give us a quick introduction to yourself and your work?
Absolutely. So my previous book is True to the Earth, Pagan Political Theology. So I do a lot of work on paganism, but I'm also a practicing occultist. I've taught many classes for the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival, also for the Cauldron Black. And I've also given several talks for Astromagia, which is an astrological magic conference. And yeah, my work is about paganism and occultism from the perspective generally of a paganism that's deeply committed to multiplicity and sort of polyvalent meanings, right? And my most recent work, which we're going to be talking about, is largely focused on necromancy.
For our listeners who haven't read your first book, True to the Earth, I highly recommend that you do so. You've been very busy recently. I really enjoyed your presentation for the Salem Witch Fest titled Magic Against Control. How was that as an experience?
I mean, it's always amazing presenting for Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival. And that class in particular, I really enjoyed. It was a little bit of a different experience for me because often my classes are very tightly planned out. But this time around, and I guess I hadn't thought about it, but I guess it's appropriate for the topic I was engaging with, sort of the freedom of chaos. This time around, it was a little less tightly planned. So I was sort of a bit more free-flowing than I usually am, and I think it went very well. But it's also such an important topic, right? So the basic idea is, and this comes out in my book, True to the Earth, from a pre-writing polytheist pagan perspective, the nature of the cosmos, the nature of reality is change and is chaos, right? Order can be temporarily constructed, but ultimately we get multiplicity, right? That cannot be reduced to any one singular source or ultimate truth. And you get an ongoing force of creation and change, which we can call chaos, right? So a lot of the older magics, this is my argument, can be identified as relying heavily upon this sort of force of change and force of chaos, and opposing attempts to dominate and control reality. So in a time when we might be facing increasing tyranny, increasing forces of control and domination, reaching back into these forces of chaos and change can be very useful and very powerful.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I really enjoyed it, and I think the way in which you tackle the historical material in the PGM specifically, in the Greek magical papyri specifically, was really interesting. And I think for everyone out there who's listening, who's interested in learning about this, please go and check out Cadmus's presentation through the Salem Witch Fest. It was very enlightening, very interesting. So thank you for doing that for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Mhm.
I certainly found it to be very, very useful and powerful and
Mm.
valuable for me.
Mm. But today we're here to talk about your upcoming work, Learning from Legendary Practitioners. You begin the book by asking a question, which then you go on to comprehensively answer. What if a student of history and myth could speak to the characters that occupy the records of cultures long lost? What if a practitioner of magic could learn from the greats who went before? So, what was the inspiration that led you to create this book?
Yeah, so the book comes out of several classes as a base that I taught partially for the Salem Witch Fest and partially for the Cauldron Black. But those classes were built out of actual experiments where I had reached out to various spirits of ancient practitioners of magic. And all of this started with a project to contact the very sort of famous blind prophet Tiresias. So it all starts with my attempt to contact Tiresias and learn from him. And the inspiration for this was that I was working on True to the Earth, which is an attempt to sort of figure out the key insights that have been lost from when ancient Greece, for example, was an oral society, right? So we don't have writing that perfectly captures these insights and this perspective. And a lot of it was about what must religion have been like, what must magic have been like before the institution of writing. And it struck me, well, I'm a practicing occultist, right? And I had done necromantic work before. So why not reach out to someone who was alive at the time, right? Why not learn from the spirits of the people who had direct experience of this? So that's why I turned to Tiresias, because Tiresias, if you in the book, I go into the potential timeline, but he would have definitely predated writing in Greece. He also would have predated probably the Mycenaean period in Greece, but that's beside the point. I decide to reach out to Tiresias to learn more about this period, about what the religious perspectives were, what we could call the sort of metaphysical perspectives, and what the approaches to things like magic were. That was the inspiration for the project, and then it grew from there with reaching out to other such figures, right?
So we today would call that an act of necromancy. Is this something that would have been historically done by the people of the time Tiresias was, I say it quote unquote alive, because whether or not he was ever a real individual is up for debate, but there is definitely some core to the story that may have been true. But yeah, how would you, how would people of that era would have, how would they have defined this form of magic? I say again, magic in air quotes.
Yeah, I mean, our oldest depiction of necromancy comes from the Odyssey, right? Which an epic poem by Homer that was composed by Homer, it was composed over extended periods of time by generations of oral poets, but eventually written down maybe by someone called Homer. Uh, but anyway, it's very old, predates writing, right? Predates writing in Greece. So it was orally composed and it captures several different periods of culture in Greece. But in it, Odysseus uh, has to contact the blind prophet Tiresias, right? Contact his spirit in order to learn things, right? In order to learn how best he might safely return home and how to avoid the dangers that stand between him and the return home and how to deal with the fact that the god Poseidon is angry at him and trying to keep him from being able to return home. So, absolutely, the idea of talking with spirits of the dead in order to learn things that was very much alive at the time. It was very much I wouldn't say commonplace, right? But certainly there were traditions of it, and it was definitely a known practice.
So necromancy during this era of history was, and specifically contacting spirits like Tiresias, was already an ancient practice.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, right. One thing to understand the uniqueness or the difference between where we find ourselves today and how these things would have been understood in a sort of well, during the classical period as well, but even older during the pre-writing periods in Greece, for example. But we get the same feeling in Rome as well. Um, and you see this in the PGM as well. So for us, there have been extended theological systems that attempt to distance the living from the dead. So entire ideas about, oh no, the dead are inaccessible, they're in hell or they're in heaven, right? And maybe we end up with the idea that there's something like a haunting every now and then. But actually, Protestantism, for example, says that hauntings are impossible. There's no such thing as ghosts, right? If you have a haunting, it's got to be demonic, right? If you think you've spoken with the dead or the dead have contacted you, it's got to be demonic, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of work put in by, for example, Christianity and Catholicism and Protestantism to build massive walls and distance between us and the dead. And there's a lot that goes into that. Part of it is a Platonic inheritance where you end up with separate worlds, right? So the dead end up occupying separate worlds. Now, within these older views, right, the sort of pre-monotheistic views, there's no distance between us and the dead. In fact, you would get closer to the worldview if you imagine that the dead were way too close and way too common, right? In other words, we are surrounded by the dead. They are present all the time, often as a help, often as a danger, right? That the dead are a serious, serious presence within the world and within our lives. So when you then say, oh, I'm going to learn stuff from the dead, it doesn't have the air of the extraordinary. It actually has the air of the everyday to some extent. Right. Now, when you say I'm going to contact a really famous, important dead person, well, that's something different, right? I'm going to talk to Tiresias. That's something different. But certainly your ancestors would be understood to be present, to be paying attention to you, to be concerned about you, to be checking in, to be often angry because you have not properly honored them. And so they're messing with you and sending things off the rails because of that, and so on. Right. So the relationship between the living and the dead had to constantly be negotiated and tended to with great care. Uh, so once you have that entire system, right? Once you have that setup where you're like, no, the dead are all around us, the dead are frequently interacting with us, and the dead are a power. Because that's the other thing. The power of the dead becomes less and less over time to a large extent. Uh, Partially because rising monotheism recognized that there's something pagan. There's something sort of a bit too much like those polytheists about too much of a focus on the dead. We may have more to say about this later. But the power of the dead gets taken away as time goes by. But back then, the dead were understood to have great power to disrupt cities, to endanger countries, right? I mean, huge force for the dead. So you also have that, right? That they're a very potent and important force within the world.
Hmm. So what we're really talking about then, if we're engaging with this sort of necromancy and magic today, we need to sort of recontextualize the way in which we we engage with the world. So it's sort of, I think the best word for it is the hermeneutic of the reality in which we reside within. We have to, like you said, negotiate with the dead, but we're also learning to sort of negotiate with the way in which we engage with reality itself. And so adopting something of what the ancient Greeks perceived of the universe, perceived of the world, and trying to inhabit that mental space is just as important as learning all the other, ritual steps, etc.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? So I had mentioned in brief, and I don't want to dig too much into the sort of more complicated philosophical aspects of Platonism and so on and so forth. But if you don't have the idea of a transcendent reality, in other words, the two world model that we inherit from Plato that gets taken up by, even though it wasn't original to most monotheistic religions, but it gets taken up by monotheistic religions. So within that model, right, this world is one thing, and then the real heart of reality, what matters is elsewhere, is transcendent, is heaven, or is so on and so forth. If you don't have that model, right? So how do things look without that model? Well, for the let's say Homeric Greeks, the underworld was a place in this world, right? And Olympus was a place in this world, right? The gods were here, the dead was here. You see this with, and we may talk more about this later, but you see this with oracles of the dead. There were temples that were kept in caves primarily. There are some that weren't in caves, but certainly in caves. And these were places that were understood to be access points to the underworld, and this not symbolically or ritualistically alone, but rather actually, right? There were caves that like had poisonous gas in them, and people knew like if you venture into that cave, you will die. And part of the understanding was that the cave goes all the way into the underworld, right? That it's accessible, it's there, but it's also exceptionally dangerous to try to traverse. And for most people, it's going to be deadly, right? So you end up with when you have this perspective, you end up being able to access things and understanding that things are more accessible than we are used to thinking. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think you mentioned in your presentation for the Salem Witch Fest about the cave where Heracles drags Cerberus out from the underworld, and the wolfbane which grows naturally in that area. And so you find that there's this really interesting like chicken and egg sort of situation arriving. Like, does the wolfbane exist there because Hercules dragged Cerberus out there, or does the presence of the wolfbane create or become part of the myth which generated, you know, which made that cave be important in the first place for that myth? So, yeah, and that's like the interplay again with like nature and the underworld.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And this was one of the famous oracles of the dead, right? It's in a region of Greece that has a lot of wolfbane. Wolfbane is very
Mhm.
common. And the myth is that wolfbane grows from the spittle of Cerberus, right? So when Heracles drags Cerberus out of the underworld, his spittle falls on the ground and it becomes wolfbane, and wolfbane grows there. So this is the origin of wolfbane. So yeah, right. Is this where wolfbane comes from, or does that cave end up having this myth because of the presence of wolfbane? Nowadays, we might really try to distinguish between these two views. But what I think is interesting is that there's another way to understand it as well, which is wherever the cave might have been. If you take seriously the idea that wolfbane contains Cerberus to some extent, right? That the the body, the spittle, the being of Cerberus is also in the Wolfbane. Well, then, yeah, where Wolfbane is present, the underworld is going to be closer, right? And because the underworld's guardian is partially present there, right? So it's not, oh, this is just a sort of rational way of understanding why this might be there. There's also an occult way to understand that the presence of Wolfbane, whether or not this was the actual cave with Heracles or Heracles ever existed, right? But the presence of Wolfbane makes doorways to the underworld more present. And think about that. That's just both very materialistic and literal, right? Eat some Wolfbane, you're gonna encounter the underworld, right? So, I mean, there is a literal sense in which Wolfbane is a gateway to the underworld.
Yeah.
Uh, but there's also a sense in which if we learn how to navigate it, how to use it, how to relate to it, it's a gateway that may allow us to access the underworld without having to die, right?
Mm. Really, really fascinating. And when we have that understanding that the underworld is close to us, it's literally underneath the stone, or it's, in the leaf that's fallen off the tree. It's something that's present and can be accessed easily, as opposed to, like, as you mentioned previously, like the Neoplatonic concept of a higher realm or something. It leads to a comprehension or an understanding of reality as something that's like completely interwoven, as opposed to, like being sheets of different materials. So it's a perspective that I find I'm infinitely sympathetic to. I love it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, and I go into this in True to the Earth, but this is why I'm obsessed with the distinction between the term universe and the cosmos, right?
Yeah.
So the ancient Greek term cosmos, if you sort of dig back into the etymology of it, it comes from weaving, right? Specifically, the sort of braided hair of a horse, right? So the cosmos is a thing that is braided and woven together, right? So it's many things woven together. Whereas the universe, right, the unification is already there, right? And even if you end up, there are ways to try to push it in the direction of pluralism, which is what I would want to do, right? So universe ends up being many verses, right? Many either paths and turns, right? Or many sort of turns of poetry, even, right? Coming together. But the overall sense of it is one, right? Whereas Cosmos is always going to be many woven together. Yeah.
Hmm. So to return to your book, you go on to mention the work of Al Cummins and Philip Leggard, specifically their excellent book of magic, in which the good doctor describes this specific form of necromancy as epistemic evocation. So, for our listeners, could you describe something of the meaning of this term?
Yeah, for sure. And since you've mentioned Al, I actually meant to mention him earlier when you asked for the inspiration behind my book as well. Al Cummins and I are good friends, and we've been talking for years about this kind of stuff. So certainly he is one of the major inspirations for me for the idea of contacting the dead in order to learn more about magic and about history. Al is, of course, a historian, but yeah, that idea of using our occult skills in order to improve our sort of academic pursuits, right? To assist in that, it's yeah, he's a big inspiration, but also in the excellent book of the Art of Magic, right? So this book that Al and Philip have put out, in it you have a very careful record of folks who are contacting. Sometimes they're contacting angels and whatnot, but a lot of the people they're contacting are the dead, including Adam and Moses and so on and so forth. And they're contacting these and Solomon, of course, but they're contacting these spirits of the dead in order to learn magic. Right. So they're practicing magic, contacting spirits of the dead, and asking for better magic, right? For guidance in that. So yes, Al talks about it as epistemic evocation. So what is epistemic evocation? It's precisely this. It's using evocation, calling forth spirits in order to learn something, right? That's the epistemic idea, right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? So it's evocation for the sake of knowledge. And the oldest depictions of necromancy we have are epistemic evocation, right? I'd already mentioned Odysseus, but this continues, right? We have tons and tons of examples of this, especially in literature. very often in literature in both the Hellenistic period, but then also in Rome, that depict Tiresias as frequently calling forth spirits of the dead in order to learn about events in the world. Certainly, the Witch of Endor, right in the Bible, right? She was turned to in order to call forth the spirit of a dead prophet, right? To learn things. So this idea of evocation for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of gaining knowledge that is not accessible to the living, but is accessible to the dead.
Mm. So if we look at texts like the Hygromanteia, we see this it's a form the form of magic that's being done is quite interesting from my perspective, because in the modern day we have all these terms such as divination, scrying, evocation, etc. But when you look back through the historical record, you start to see that these terms aren't so they're not so concrete in their distinction. And so like the hygromantia, for instance, has instances where you're conjuring demons into these balls of water, but there's very little difference for of performing that than there is for, say, performing what an oracle would have been performing in ancient Greece. So like could you talk a little bit about the distinction, if any, between these practices, and how and why do you think they've sort of evolved into in the current system, the current way that we work magic today?
It's sort of a tricky question, right? A lot of the distinctions, when too firmly insisted upon, are going to be later developments. Um, for several reasons, partially because within sort of more monotheistic contexts, you end up having to legislate what powers different practices and therefore which ones are legitimate and which ones are not, right? So suddenly it really matters sort of what the source of, for example, your divination is and things like that. Um, Within the ancient context, uh, of course, there'll be different goals that you're going to engage in. Um, but also let me put it this way, right? If you are performing a sacrifice, right, and praying to a specific god because you need assistance with something, right? Clearly, you're trying to do something very specific, right? You want help, you're calling to this god, you're giving an offering. But then when something unexpected happens, right? When like a hawk swoops down or a snake comes out from the altar or whatever the case may be, right? This has a divinatory aspect too, right? And part of the recognition is that every act of ritual, and it's not just ritual, it's really every act, but every act of ritual is an act of communication as well. And communication is a two or more way street, right? So you're not just performing a specific act, you're also hoping for a response and listening for the response and seeing what the response is, and also fearing the response, right? So every religious and ritual and what we would call sort of occult practice is going to also have that divinatory aspect, because this is how the communication is sort of recognized and occurs. Does that make some sense? Does that overlap with what you were asking?
Yeah, yeah. I just think it's interesting that in the modern day we have these like very specific terminologies for, well, that's divination, or well, this is evocation, this is invocation. But when we look back through the historical record, we see that actually these are not particularly distinct things. Um, and returning to the idea of the epistemic evocation is this idea that we're learning something in a form of divinatory way, however that might manifest, but gazing into oil on water or looking into smoke. But at the same time, we are very much conjuring a spirit, and so
Yeah.
uh,
I think a key point here, I should have mentioned it. Sometimes I miss that this is not necessarily a given in the way that it's a given for me. But a key point here is that it's spirit based, right? That if you are performing divination, there has to be some sort of like I said, communication with a spirit, right? Whereas nowadays you might find folks who are like, oh yeah, I read tarot or whatever the case may be, but there's no actual like spirit that I'm pacting with, or that I'm contacting, or that I'm calling forth in order to do this. There's some sort of, I don't know, I guess inherent power in the system of tarot or something like that. Now, I would still, because I'm an animist and very spirit based, would assume that we would interpret that as the spirit within the system of tarot, but that's beside the point, right? So you can end up, you see this a lot with astrology, for example, with the idea of a system that can predict, that can inform, that can give you divinatory information without there being any spirit contact or any sort of spirit power behind it. That would have been very foreign to the context we're talking about, right? So, yeah, part of the basis here is that, look, if divination is happening, right, it's happening because there are spirits involved. Maybe they're gods, maybe it's the dead. It depends on the details of what we're doing. Maybe they're daimons, right? Sort of neither gods nor the dead nor human, right? But spirits are involved. You see this contrast. I had mentioned astrology. And I had mentioned this to you a bit before we actually started. But you see this contrast in what we could call sort of pre-astrological divination connected to the sky and the heavens, right? So before the full development of what we could call the system of astrology that begins happening largely in the Hellenistic period, right? But before that, there was tons of divination that involved what was happening with the stars and what was happening in the sky. But I would argue, and this goes especially for when we go all the way back to the oral period, what was happening in the sky was meaningful because of what you were doing and the way in which it was a response to it. So it wasn't just where is Jupiter in the sky? It's when I performed this sacrifice and said this prayer, Jupiter appeared from behind a cloud, right? And that has importance, right? Or Jupiter, if we don't want to sort of focus necessarily on the clouds, although that would have been just as much a system of sort of divining the heavens, but suddenly the planet Jupiter caught my eye and seemed to be more lively, right? This, if anyone practices any sort of magic with the stars and the fixed stars, this becomes very, very common. I'll step outside and suddenly one star will call to me, right? And it's just that one star, for whatever reason, is really lively, and it's clearly sort of poking at me, right? It's flashing at me, it's talking to me. So yeah, I mean, these things happen, and it's not just where is, Regulus right now in the sky. It's what's Regulus doing, right? Doing in a way that is phenomenal, right? That is perceptual, that is tied into its communication with me at this moment. Yeah. So,
Much in the same way as if a snake jumped out from your altar, as you mentioned before, or
yeah.
the way in which oil is moving over the water, or the smoke is billowing out from the incense burner. Yeah, so uh, it goes ultimately, it all goes back to this idea of plurality that you're so fond of, and I'm very fond of myself. So it's interesting how we can like interpret the way in which the call comes back to us after we make this and our initial call through magical operation. Um, so how would say an epistemic evocation be performed? How would one begin? Maybe you don't have to explain the entire process, but could you just give us a short description of what one could do to initiate the process?
Yeah. I use, and this is not, it's not one size fits all, right? So my approach differs depending upon who I'm trying to contact and what their nature is and so on and so forth. But I use as a model the necromancy of Odysseus within the Odyssey, right? So how did he perform what he performed, right? Well, there were sacrifices made to Hades and Persephone. There were prayers given to Hades and Persephone. So the idea is that, like, look, the rulers of the underworld are going to have to assist you here, right? They're going to have to allow this to occur, right? And then there are separate offerings given to the spirits you want to talk to, and you call to them, right? Now, for me, it gets a bit more complicated, right? Because Odysseus had the benefit of being either in the underworld at the time or on the very border of it, right? In other words, he was in a very, very special place, right? And this is useful, right? I talk a lot about this in one of the later chapters in the book that was developed from my paper in Conjure Codex, right? My chapter in Conjure Codex. Every Nekuomanteia is a Katabasis, right? So the idea is that to perform necromancy is not just to call a spirit to you, it's to actually enter the underworld. And that goes for whether I'm doing it here in my house in which I've created a temple space, or I'm doing it in a graveyard, or I've gone to a cave, or Lord knows what, right? That every act of necromancy is a process of going to the underworld. Okay, so how do we do that, right? Uh, well, it's not as simple as just, asking, let's say, Hades and Persephone to sort of send the spirit that we want. We also have to open a doorway, right? We have to make the space where we are closer to the underworld. And we could do like what Odysseus does, choose a space that's already close to the underworld. So what's that? Well, I mean, cemeteries and graveyards, right? Battlefields, right? There's a lot of depictions in literature of Tiresias liking to summon forth the spirits of the dead on fields of battle, right? Places where blood has been spilled, right? So there's that. But you can also have your space and attempt to make it closer to the underworld, right? I call this sort of creating an annex of the underworld. You're literally putting part of your space into the underworld as a passageway, right? This is how I interpret things like a magical circle or a process of consecration for a space in which we're working, right? It's not specifically to protect you and to keep things out. In fact, the more you focus on the idea of keeping things out, the less effective this is going to be to some extent. It's instead making clear that this space is now no longer that of simply the world of the living, that this space is being given, at least temporarily, over to the world of the dead, to the underworld, and going through a process of bringing those territories closer together.
So it's sort of like a diving bell.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Like a diving bell, yeah, for sure. This is one reason why, in a lot of examples, like, so for example, in the discovery of witchcraft, in Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, there's a ritual in there that's really very striking where you perform part of it at a graveside, and then you go home and perform the rest at home, right? And this was a big influence on me because it's quite convenient, right? It can be very hard to find or to have access to a cemetery where you're able to do a very involved ritual at night and so on and so forth. At the time when I was doing a lot of this stuff, I lived in Brooklyn, and Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn is an amazing place, and I'm deeply in love with it, and I've done a lot of work there. However, it is not easily accessible at night. We'll just put it that way. They actually have like guard dogs and things like this, right? So, what you are doing is you're setting up a connection, right? You go to the annex, you go to the sort of embassy of the underworld, you go to the cemetery, you set up the connection, you sort of arrange the passport, and then you go home, and that's when you are able to complete the ritual, right? part of the value of things like grave dirt and cemetery dirt is that they allow you to bring some of that sort of embassy of the dead home with you as well.
That's a really interesting explanation of like how we approach the graveyard and how we create an annex, as you said, or an embassy through which that we simultaneously exist in one world and the other, and we can more easily contact such spirits. But for instance, like what are the sort of offerings that one could consider using? And I'm specifically thinking about I want to learn from, say, as an example, I want to learn from a specific ancient author or ancient astrologer, for instance, and I perform my ritual. What kind of thing would tempt such a shade of the dead to return to me? So and this is a bigger question actually, and we could maybe you could go into this in your answer, but we have, depending on the era of which we're discussing such necromancy, different interpretations of what the underworld experience itself is actually like. So so how would you or what would you go about using to, as I said, tempt such a shade to come back to communicate with you?
Yeah, for sure. So, certainly, right. I've just directed you all to look at, Odysseus's necromancy and his big sort of offerings were animal sacrifice. I did not and do not perform during the course of my necromantic practices at home and whatnot, animal sacrifice. Um, so I was not offering blood when I contacted Tiresias. I did not offer blood or anything like that. I feel the need to mention it because it's certainly traditional, and there are still very live and potent practices that involve this. It has not generally been my approach, right? So, for example, when I contacted Tiresias, what were my offerings? Right. For Tiresias in particular, there was a slightly complicated process involved. So I used a intermediary. In other words, I used a spirit of the dead I had already developed a very strong relationship with. I asked that spirit to contact Tiresias for me or to assist in the process. So there was that. But in terms of offerings, there were sort of two phases, right? One was in the cemetery on top of the grave of the person who was the intermediary. That's why I mentioned the intermediary. On top of his grave, I had a picnic, right? The picnic was set for three people. One for me, right? And then one for my intermediary spirit and one for Tiresias, right? I had actually, if I remember right, a roast chicken. I had some wine and there was some bread that I had baked myself, right? So opening offerings were some water, some wine, roast chicken, etc. Right? Basically a meal, food. Now, on the sort of later process when I actually was summoning forth the shade of Tiresias, because this picnic was just sort of setting the groundwork. When I was summoning the shade of Tiresias, I followed Odysseus in regard to most of the details except for the blood, right? So I offered olive oil, I offered wine, I offered honey. There was bread offered to actually Hades and Persephone, not to Tiresias himself. And I offered barley, right? So the scattering of barley, the offering of barley is very, very common within the ancient Greek context. Barley was a symbol of life and of wealth, and it was literally life, right? It was this sort of potent force of fertility. You'll see me. I mean, you probably won't see me, but if you saw me in the cemetery working, I do a lot with scattering barley, right? Okay, now that was Tiresias, right? This is some ancient guy. This is what he would have been familiar with. And there is a long-standing tradition, by the way, of wine, especially red wine, playing the role of blood, right? We have a lot of examples of that as well. So there is some interesting overlap there too. But let's say I'm not contacting Tiresias, right? Say you want to contact a dead author. Well, the intermediary spirit I mentioned is a dead author. When I was first getting to know him, right, and contacting him, what did I offer? Well, once we had some communication, he informed me that he really liked brandy. So I give him brandy quite frequently. I'll also give food. Bread is very common for me, but that's because I'm a baker. I like making bread, so I'll offer bread that I've baked myself. This is very, very common for me. But, and this is where things get interesting, for this spirit in particular, I found a copy of his book, right? He had edited a book. It is long out of print because he is long, long dead. But I purchased a copy of his book and I went to his gravesite while we were developing a relationship and an allyship. I went to his gravesite with the book and I said, hey, like I found your book. Here's your book. And I mentioned this in my in the book, but I've never felt the kind of response that I felt that day when I showed up at his gravesite with his book, right? There was just a feeling of absolute excitement like you wouldn't imagine, right? Like it was palpable how amazingly pleased he was that I'm showing up at his grave with his book, right? So it depends on who we're contacting. Even I talk about Eliphas Levi, and Levi's not ideal for a lot of this stuff, in my opinion, but he does talk about different approaches to necromancy, and he divides acceptable necromancy, right? There's unacceptable too, but he divides acceptable necromancy into two types, right? There's works of knowledge and there's works of love. And certainly for both of them, a key element is to be offering to the person you're trying to contact the things you know they cared about. And that's assuming you know that they cared about something. So having some knowledge is useful. If it's an author, we can certainly learn a lot about most authors, so that can be helpful.
In that moment when you brought the book to his gravesite, the book itself transforms from a mundane object into an access point into the underworld in that moment, right? So perhaps that's what you were experiencing. You're experiencing that opening of or transformation of that the mundane material of the book transforming into this much more potent object of power and connectivity between you and this spirit. So that's really a beautiful way of describing it. And I'm
And
really
that's the role it now plays for me, is that it's on
Mhm.
my altar to my ancestors and my dead allies and so on and so forth. And that book is direct access to him, right? Like when I need to speak with him, really, I just even just looking at it, but I touch the book, etc. Right? There is a connection there that is very, very strong.
and like your entire example, I think, is really important because what it does is I think when you say you give a sacrifice to a spirit, we all, generally people think, oh, so, a goat and, you have to let blood and all this sort of stuff. But there's so many more dimensions that we can explore in regard to this. And for instance, finding somebody's book, or an object that was deeply personal and meaningful to them, and then returning it to them in that way, I think is just such a really beautiful way of describing the process of sacrifice because, like you said, you're building not just a friendship but an allyship. You're going out of your way, spending serious time to aid this person in the afterworld, in the underworld, and
Yeah.
to do something so meaningful for them. You know, of course, even if they were alive and you brought the book to them, they'd be overjoyed. You're doing it to them after they've been dead for however long is so deeply moving and meaningful. So it just means that I think people who are listening, we don't just have to give, incense and blood and wine, this, there's so many different ways that we can tackle this. And I think your example is just absolutely perfect.
And there's such a long-standing tradition that we get from the monotheistic sort of Christian context, right? But such a long-standing tradition of the importance of acts of charity and having masses said for people and praying for them and also going out and doing good actions in their name.
Mm.
And all of this is a type of offering as well. Certainly, when you look at a lot of grimoire recommendations, doing things like this are ways of paying spirits, of paying spirits of the dead, of contacting them, of forming relationships.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, there's a wide variety beyond food, drink, and other such issues. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mentioned before, but we didn't quite get to it, but I'd like to circle back to it. But it's the types of afterlife that I think are really interesting because, like you mentioned just then, like from a more modern Christian perspective, the souls of the dead in purgatory, for instance, we can pray for them to aid them to progress through the afterlife faster, or we'll eventually get to heaven faster. Some traditions of grimoire work have you do the same thing for fallen angels or demons. Um, but then we have the ancient Greek interpretation or the ancient Jewish interpretation of the afterlife is a much more bleak place. And do you think there's how do I put this? While we're engaging with these forms of the underworld, how much do we have to take into account the evolution of this realm as it's evolved in the way in which humans interpret it over the centuries?
Um, it's interesting. I think it is useful to have as nuanced a view of the changes that have happened in understanding the afterlife as possible, right? I think that that is inherently valuable. And of course, I think people will land upon the versions that perhaps they feel they can connect with the most or that make the most sense. I will say that I am well, I'm not a big fan of the idea of belief in general, right? I was gonna say I'm agnostic, but that sort of has the wrong feel because I just don't think belief is particularly interesting or important, right? But putting that aside, I have no commitments as to the actual nature of the afterlife, despite what this spirit or that spirit may say, right? I think that we always have to take these things with a whole lot of grains of salt, right? So that being said, I do think one of the interesting things is uh, that when you look at the necromancy of Odysseus, for example, when you have provided um, offerings to the dead, they transform from mindless, empty shades to coherent, entities with understanding who can speak to you and provide you with knowledge. Now, one reason why Tiresias is important is that it's clear that Tiresias, I mean, this is what we're told. Tiresias, one of his gifts from the gods was that he remains himself in the afterlife. But Achilles, for example, does not, right? Achilles is a empty shade in Homer. In Homer, he's a hungry, wandering, empty shade until fed. And once he's fed, he can speak to you about his life and about what the afterlife is like, and so on and so forth, right? Um, Now, the reason why I think this is interesting is that it does show that engaging with the dead provides them with agency and with life and with coherence. This is from a Homeric perspective that they wouldn't have had otherwise, right? Um, so I think this is quite interesting.
Hmm.
In regards to that, go ahead.
I was going to say, and to what extent is this safe? Or is this, by its very nature, quite a dangerous practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, right? So it it can indeed be dangerous, but also we don't want to sort of over dramatize the dangers as well. One way that I talk about it, so the last chapter of the book, which I'm a huge fan of because it's really it's weird to say you're a fan of your own work, but you know,
I'll say it.
most writers hate what they write, right? So it's exciting when there's something you really, really love. Um, I love it because it's a different for me. It's very practical, right? It's a chapter about how to develop a very close relationship with one spirit of the dead who you then can use as what I call a necromantic assistant, right? Basically, like a familiar, right? A dead spirit who can act as your ambassador, who can assist you in all of this work. So in that book, in that chapter, I talk about the fact that part of what I'm advising you how to do is create a haunting, right? Like you are trying to provoke a haunting upon yourself, right? And this to a large extent is what necromancy is. It's just that it might be temporary, but if you're forming a relationship, it's not, right? You're intending to create an ongoing haunting. So of course, this can be dangerous, right? There are ways that this can go awry. But I think that it's to demystify some of this, or perhaps make it a bit less dramatic. If you think about it the same way you think about forming relationships with human beings, it's very similar, right? If you're forming a friendship with someone, there are risks involved, right? Now, there are dramatic risks. That person might be a psychopathic serial killer who's manipulating you and going to murder you, right? Sure. But that's incredibly rare, right? The bigger risks are, things might go awry. They might not be the nicest person, or they might, etc. Right? You get the problems, but we do it anyway, and we're fairly good at navigating these human relationships, right? Well, the relationship with the spirit of the dead is very, very similar, right? So part of the way I approach that last chapter is in focusing on the relationship aspect, right? And how important it is to get to know someone and feel them out and see if you're good for them. Are they good for you? It's sort of like dating with the dead. So
I
that kind
I described exactly the same thing with my work with the Grammarian Verum with my students over there. But it's like getting to know them individually before you commit, and the commitment with the Grammarian Verum would be to create a pact.
yeah.
And this is slightly different because we're not creating a pact in the Grammaric sense, but in another way, we sort of like we are still doing the same kind of negotiations. We are still doing the same kind of spirit work in a sense. But yeah,
Yeah,
how
in that chapter, right, I divide it into sort of two approaches, right? And one is the approach I took, and the other is, well, if you don't want that approach, there's this other approach. The other approach is more high ceremonial and does indeed involve a pact where you write out, here's what I will give you, here's what I want from you, right? Let's reach this agreement. Here are the terms, right? Very legalistic. You can do that, right? And there may indeed be reasons why you want to with a specific spirit.
Mhm.
I point out, for example, that the spirit I ended up developing a close relationship with wasn't like a warrior, right? Like he's not good for attacking people. If I wanted to use him as some sort of martial, like go get this person, he would be worthless for that. It's not his skill set and it's not his interests. It doesn't match his personality, right? He was a scholar. Now, if you wanted a martial warrior spirit of the dead, which some people have, some people want, so on and so forth, maybe that might be a good time to have
Mhm.
pretty clear-cut boundaries, limits, and rules, right? It's not the approach I took because it wasn't the kind of spirit I was dealing with. But
Mhm.
those things, you can have a very sort of verum pact based approach to this as well.
Mhm. So we've we've talked a lot about Tiresias, and maybe we've touched on one or two of the other characters. But for our listeners, who are the main dramatis personae of that you highlight in your book of legendary practitioners, and why did you choose them?
Yeah, so the way the book is organized is that for the first half of it, Each chapter is about one figure, one legendary practitioner. So, chapter on Tiresias. And in each chapter, I try to provide the best in terms of historical, literary, and even archaeological analysis of who they were, if they existed at all, what would their time have been like, etc. Right? So I try to provide the best grasp of who they are. And then in the second half of each chapter, I explain how I contacted them and what I learned when I contacted them, what contacting them was like, what they have to say, right? So Tiresias is the first one. There's a chapter on Circe or Kirke, right? There's no soft sort of Circe sound in ancient Greek. So I prefer Kirke, but right, the witch, right? I hesitate and I'll explain why, right? But
She's a pharmakos, right?
yeah,
She's not necessarily a witch because the idea of witch is a Christian construct which comes centuries later, really. I mean,
yes,
it's kind of
absolutely.
it's very nebulous, but the we can't project the word witch very easily onto these ancient characters.
Absolutely, right. But what's interesting is that Circe is one of, if you look at the development of what would become the concept of the witch, Circe is this central figure, right? And that's why we have all these like paintings, right? Circe like enchanting with a wand
Mhm.
and yada yada yada, right? And she is described as having a wand and so on, right? Um, Turns out goddess is a better way to think about Circe for sure. But I also looked, so there's a chapter about Medea, um,
Which I
which
learned
is
a lot about Medea through this chapter because I had a good understanding of who she was, and I thought I had a reading of her basic myth down. And your book opened up an entirely different dimension to this specific character for me. So that was really cool. Thank you.
yeah, I mean, arguably Medea might be the most complicated figure that has her own chapter in the book, right? At least partially because, there may have been a concerted effort to develop her character in a certain way within classical Greece, right? In other words, there's possibilities that there's a bit of a conspiracy theory about how she's depicted. And of course, she ends up being wrapped up as well, as Circe does too, but to a less extent, wrapped up in questions of like what is Greek, what isn't Greek, what is the foreigner like versus the Greek. And so I mean, there's lots of politics involved in how
Yeah.
Medea has been depicted
And
and
so
understood.
you there's this point where you make a point about how her and Hera have a very ancient link to the point where um, one may have influenced the conceptualization of the other, and they might actually be one and the same, and they share a very distant uh, is it Mycenaean or even pre-Mycenaean origin as a goddess
Yes, yeah.
that far predates the current understanding or the Homeric understanding of Medea that we have today.
Yes, absolutely, right. So there are reasons to think that so all this goes back to Corinth, right? And trying to understand certain religious developments within Corinth. But there are reasons to think that a temple that would later become a temple to Hera. And during the classical period, right, Corinth, the patron of Corinth was Hera, right? Hera, just like Athena was the patron of Athens, right? So what would become the temple to Hera? There are reasons to think it may originally have been a temple to Medea. In other words, there's reason to think that we may have had sort of the goddess Medea supplanted by Hera in the transition to sort of the polis religion and the centralization within the polis of a lot of ancient Greek religion.
And with
It's
Medea, it's this,
speculative, but there's archaeological reasons for that. And yeah, sorry, go
and
ahead.
and so Medea is like this really like what's the best way of putting it? She's this really archaic um, force of nature that's very dangerous. I mean, not to say that Hera isn't dangerous,
Yeah.
because Hera is also, while fantastic, also incredibly terrifying.
Oh yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean they share that, right? They're both from a certain perspective protectors of children, for example, and they're both killers of children, right?
Mhm.
On various tellings of both of their myths.
Mm.
Um, Also, Hera has a history of creating, whether overtly or not, these spirits who end up being female spirits who kill children. And Corinth has a tie into that. So if you look into the sort of mythology behind like Lamia and whatnot, there's a connection here with sort of children murdering female sort of spirits. Yeah. So there's a chapter on Medea. There's a chapter on Orpheus as well. And then there's a chapter which is different from all the others on Macbeth, right? And this chapter asks the question, all right, who were the witches of Macbeth, right? Where did the witches of Macbeth come from? So that's different because it's not the ancient Greek context per se, although there ends up being some important connections. And in that chapter specifically, I look very carefully at the Scottish witch trials that inspired the writing of Macbeth. I look at King James, who Macbeth was written for. So once he took the throne of England and became hopefully, Shakespeare's new patron, Shakespeare wrote Macbeth for him, which is about largely, right, very thinly veiled, but James's own experience with understanding himself as having been attacked by a conspiracy of witches who were trying to use a nobleman to overthrow James up in Scotland, right? So it's sort of an involved story. But in that chapter, I look at three witches. There were more than that involved in the Scottish witch trials, but three people accused of witchcraft, right? I do end up calling them witches because when I talked to them, they didn't seem to mind. At least one of them, possibly all three of them, were folk practitioners of healing, right?
Cunning women.
So what was it? Yeah, cunning,
Cunning.
two cunning women and one perhaps cunning man. He's a little less clear. But Agnes Sampson, Gilly Duncan, and John Fian are the three I look at extensively. But I also look at the three fairy queens, right? And who are the three fairy queens, right? There's no clear cut the three fairy queens, but I go through the various different proposals for who the queen of the fairies is. I sort of make my pitch for three specific fairy queens. So that's all in that chapter. There's a lot in that chapter. I think it's actually quite a bit longer than a lot of the others, but I love it. So those are the main sort of figures I discuss.
And so I particularly want to talk about Tiresias because uh, I think he has a very interesting archetypical nature, for want of a better word. Um, could you give us a little bit about this really special character in ancient Greek mythology?
Yeah. I mean, of course, everyone knows the sort of old Tiresias, right? In other words, people know him as a spirit that Odysseus talks to, and people know him as a prophet that shows up in not all, but so many of the Athenian tragedies, right? So he's a figure in Thebes. He's a counselor to the Theban royal family. But his myth before all of that is so interesting, right? So the story goes, and there are variations on this, but the story goes that Tiresias is born a man. He comes upon two snakes having sex, and for like why this is, there are different attempts to explain, but it's not clear. He breaks them up, he stops them from having sex, and because of that, he's cursed or punished, or maybe just sort of maybe neither cursed nor punished. But he is transformed into a woman. He then lives as a woman for many years, during which he becomes a priestess. So, he was a priest formerly. He becomes a priestess, right, of a goddess. They sort of there are debates about which goddess he's a priestess of, which god he's a priest of at a given moment. But then years later, he comes upon two snakes again having sex. Either he breaks them up again and is transformed again, or he leaves them be. Two different versions at least. And he is transformed back into a man, right? Now, the thing that makes Tiresias Tiresias is partially that he goes through these repeated transformations, but also that then this is one version of the story. There are others, but Zeus and Hera are having an argument about who has the most pleasure during sex, the man or the woman. And of course, neither of them can settle it, right? So they need someone who has experienced sex as a man and experienced sex as a woman. So they go to Tiresias to settle the question. And he ends up giving an answer that disagrees with Hera's. And so she strikes him blind, right, as punishment, right? And then Zeus provides him with various gifts to make up for the blindness. So the gifts are a staff, which always leads his feet perfectly, right? The power of prophecy, so the ability to prophesize. A 7-generation lifespan, so he will live for 7 generations. And then finally, that in death he will remain cognizant and entirely himself, right? He will maintain wisdom and knowledge in death. So that's how we get the Tiresias, who then is counselor to the royal family of Thebes. What's interesting is that 7-generation lifespan, traditionally the mythological rulers of Thebes ruled for 7 generations, right? They start with Cadmus, right? And then it's his bloodline. And we get and you know, Creon is in there and Oedipus is in there and so on and so forth, right? We get the various generations of rulers. And then right at the end of Tiresias's life, it's also the downfall of the house of Cadmus, right? So Cadmus's royal house falls and Tiresias dies, and that is the end of those 7 generations. So his lifespan also times the traditional mythological rulers of Thebes.
Hmm. And later on, you describe Circe as also having this sort of gender blending quality.
Yeah, and this, so Tiresias, right? If you hear the myths, you're like, oh wow, like that's literally gender bending, right? Circe is interesting because if you didn't know the culture of the times when she's depicted, you wouldn't realize that some of her aspects are gender bending, right? So when Odysseus's men come upon her, right, when they show up at her house, she's doing two things. She's weaving, which is an incredibly traditional female practice, and she's singing, which was considered very, very masculine and male, right? So already from that aspect, she's doing these two things that are contrasting, right? A few other things that come up that are interesting, right? So very often Circe is confused with Calypso in the Odyssey, right? So Calypso is a goddess, a sea nymph who you know, Odysseus ends up staying with Calypso, and Calypso wants to keep him and marry him and make him a god. Calypso wants to marry him, right? What's interesting about Circe, so Calypso is a very traditional sort of figure, right? She wants to marry the hero and make the hero a god. This is a fairly common mythological trope. Circe breaks all of that, right? Circe does not want to marry Odysseus, does not want to keep Odysseus, right? Once Odysseus has, so to speak, defeated her, but really negotiated her dangers is a better way to think about it.
And her, really, right?
Yes, yeah, they end up sleeping together and all of that. But it's clear that she does not want a husband, right? She does not want to marry him. There is a moment in the Odyssey where he is retelling the story and he claims that she wanted to marry him, but it's pretty clear that we're meant to interpret that as boasting because he's a little burned by the fact that, like, yeah, Calypso really wanted him, but Circe not so much, right?
Mm.
She enjoyed sleeping with him, but was not interested in keeping him around, right? So there's that. But then the depictions, so even the depictions of Circe, It was traditional in vase painting that men would be naked, but women would be clothed, right? It was considered sort of indecent and very unusual to have naked women depicted on vases and in paintings. But Circe is almost always depicted naked, right? So that gender strangeness, right, is captured even in her classical era depictions, right?
There's
So
something
it
wonderful about a
remains.
woman being naked being a masculine trait.
Yeah, I mean, notice how it changes, right? We wouldn't think of that, right? We don't think of singing as masculine. And, during the Renaissance, right, you would have naked women in paintings, but you would have clothed men, right? So, these things shift. So you really have to be aware of some of these cultural tropes to realize that Circe is definitely, in terms of tropes, she does not fit standard female tropes at all.
One of the questions that I really wanted to ask you while I was reading the book, while I was thinking about everything as I'm reading, was there's this theme that like Zeus and Hera go to Tiresias because he he is in a sort of liminal male female state of having existed in, as both. And we also see Circe as this liminal being with this, ancient, archaic sorcerer's power, also being, in this gender bending sort of presentation in Greek culture. So, what do you think it is about this state of existing between like male and female, or just either two opposites? Why does that in itself have, or why in itself does that attract the attention of the gods?
Yeah, so you had asked, for example, why I chose the figures I did. So it overlaps with that question, which I never really answered. But I chose figures who were important practitioners of magic, right? So it is a definite common aspect that all of these practitioners are in some sense, and it's an overused term, but they're liminal, right? They end up not fitting the categories that one would expect them to or that they should, right? And there's a power in that inability to sort of tie them down and fit them strictly into boxes, right? So Circe, for example, or Kirke, right? She had siblings, right? She's a child of the sun, right, of Helios. And she had siblings, and her siblings are like kings and queens, right? So there's Pasiphae. Granted, they're understood to be powerful and important, but there's Pasiphae, who was the wife of King Minos in Crete, right? And the mother of the Minotaur, right? And Pasiphae definitely practices some magic, but she doesn't end up having the aspect of sort of being a powerful, almost not even almost, but dangerous practitioner of magic like Circe does. Circe's brothers end up being kings. They end up overthrowing each other and so on and so forth. But also, one of them is the father of Medea, right? So, putting all that aside, right? There's a sense in which when we look at these practitioners of magic, they uh, break out of or never fit within the systems of order. This is sort of reaching back to the order and chaos, right? The systems of order
It's
that,
exactly what I was going to bring it back to. Yeah.
yeah, that keep the sort of cosmic order in balance, right? We get this in Hesiod. Hesiod strongly implies that there's something dangerous about Medea, that Medea was actually a threat to the rule of Zeus. It's very strange, right? Basically, Hesiod goes through this catalog of women, right? And a lot of these are women who have to be appropriately organized for Zeus's rule to be stable, right? Obviously, the first major one is like Metis, right? Who would give birth to Zeus's child. So instead of giving birth to a son who would overthrow Zeus, Zeus eats Metis and gives birth to Athena, right? So there's this whole aspect of there being this dangerous force that's usually called metis, right? It's this force of cleverness and power, of breaking out of boundaries and putting up new boundaries, right? Our earliest sense of what metis means is actually sort of this power to stop things and start things, right? To make rocks flow and to make water freeze, right? To make things that should move be still and to make things that shouldn't move, right? So this power of metis is a power to break the boundaries and to cause change where there quote unquote should be order, right? Or where Zeus at least is trying to establish order, right? So yeah, there is this aspect where the liminality, right, overlaps with this power, this power of metis, right? This power to break the order, right? To be a force of creation that's also a force of chaos.
So the chaos is underneath, uh, order being applied to it and affecting the world through that. I love this idea of metis. I wasn't familiar with it until I read your book. So it's could you compare it to, say, like the idea of cunning, the idea of um, I don't know, wiliness?
Yeah, absolutely, right. And that's the most standard sort of translation. So what are the figures of Metis, right? Obviously there's Athena, there's Hermes, there's Odysseus, right? Odysseus is the hero of
Well,
Metis.
I was going to ask you about its connection to Prometheus.
Yeah, I mean Prometheus also is understood to have Metis, and he's mentioned as one of these forces of Metis that is a direct danger to Zeus, and Zeus
Yes.
has to sort of uh, bring that to order in order to have a stable rule, right?
Mm.
So yeah, certainly the standard translation of metis is a type of cleverness, wiliness. This is the sense we get with Odysseus, right? Odysseus is sort of clever and sometimes too clever for his own good,
Good. Yeah.
right? Um, Same thing with sort of like the Hermes figure, right? Incredibly clever, quick-witted. Um, but the way that Metis becomes so important here is that, and you had mentioned this, but the concept of magic, right? Anyone who's looked into the anthropology of this knows what a messy sort of vexed topic it is, right? Like, how do you distinguish magic from religion, right? Who's a magical practitioner? Who's a religious practitioner? It's a train wreck when you try to sort of navigate that territory. But certainly the term magic and the concept magic derives from magi, right? It derives from the idea of in Greece, right? The idea of what those crazy Persians do, right?
Yeah.
It's actually a direct reference to
Foreigners.
the
Yeah.
Persians, right?
Mm.
And it is foreigners, right? It's like what those crazy barbarians do, right? So there is a sense of the unorthodox, right? But before we had that concept, because that doesn't really come about until after the Persian Wars, right? So before we had that concept, when Homer was writing about Circe, for example, or even mentions Medea, and Homer knew about Medea, right? What were they thinking that these people were, right? So you mentioned like a pharmacon, right? Sort of someone who is clever, right? Who knows how to use herbs and knows how to use sort of potions in ways that are powerful, right? But what is this? Part of what it is, so like this oldest meaning of metis is this idea of freeing things up, right? Making things flow, making things change, and then the reverse, right? Binding things, right? When Circe transforms Odysseus's men into pigs, right? Part of the way it's described is that they will not move, right? They will not go home again. They are bound now, right? They're not just transformed, they're transformed and bound, right? So she's loosed something, but she's also bound something. So definitely the idea of binding and of freeing as an early understanding, sort of a pre-magic understanding of what it is these folks do that's different from uh, um, what a priest does,
Mm.
right? A priest may be able to say like, "Hey, Apollo, I've been insulted. Please take vengeance," and that might happen, right? That happens in the Iliad, right? But these folks can do something different, right? They can like take a plant and unleash its hidden power and use that hidden power to cause transformations in the world, right? There's something different there in that metis from sort of the wisdom of a priesthood or something like that.
Mm. And existing in a form of liminal or uncontrollable state is sort of by uncontrollable I mean outside of the patriarchal forces of Zeus, essentially, and that positions you in a way that you can like tap into this chaos to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
produce change in the world.
I mean, I'm gonna do sort of the yes and thing again, right? Because I think it goes both ways. It's that being outside of that grants you access to this sort of power, but also um, having this source of power can cause you to be cast out, right? So Circe is a good example because, like, there were traditions that say, "Oh, she was exiled for various reasons," and often it's because of her like pharmakos nature, right? Because she was doing stuff with herbs and with these powers that was unacceptable, and so she had to be sort of pushed away, right? So we get that, right? But there's also sort of a sense in which it might be a self-exile, right? In the same way that she doesn't want to marry Odysseus, right? There's a sense in which she doesn't want anything to do with Zeus's order, right? Like she is not interested in that. So she may have placed herself in the space where she is. So yeah, it sort of goes both ways.
Going back to Circe, um, transforming Odysseus's men into pigs. You mentioned that, I mean, on the surface, we always assume that this is a really negative thing, but you write about how the transformation into being pigs, once they're returned, the men are returned to their human state, they're actually uh, what's the right word? Vivified. They've been healed. They're actually in a better state than beforehand. So could you explain a little bit about that? Because as far as I was aware, it was always that she just cursed them to become animals.
Yeah, and so this is the Roman reading, right? It's actually kind of interesting. During the Roman period, they started to interpret what she did to the men as sort of bringing out their bestial side, right? So like you're making them into beasts, and they lose their humanity and so on and so forth. But the actual transformation, first of all, right? The actual transformation, we're told that their bodies change, but their minds do not. Right. So they have not been made into beasts, right? Their bodies have, but their minds are still human, right? So there's that. This ends up being like, some versions of Platonism try to interpret Circe as this image of reincarnation, right? And the idea is that if you give in to your animal aspect, then your soul becomes animal and yada yada yada, right? And that does not match with Homer at the very least, right? But on the other hand, yeah, when she transforms them back, when Odysseus gets her to transform them back, they are younger and more beautiful than they were before, right? In other words, the transformation was good for them, right? Now, if they had stayed pigs and hung out in her pigsty, maybe that wouldn't have been good for them. But certainly, their transformation helps them, right? It's beneficial for them. And part of this ties in, I don't want to go too far into this, you can see it in the book, but ties into the nature of pigs in ancient Greek religion, right? So, like, pigs were not taken to be symbols of sort of the bestial aspects, right? Or even taken to be symbols of dirt, the way that we often think of it, like pigs as dirty, so on and so forth. Pigs were often seen as symbols of purity and purification. They were very commonly used as sacrifices to wash clean, right? So there's a connection between the idea of pigs and being washed, being purified, being cleansed. Now, Circe had the same effect on Odysseus without turning him into a pig, right? But there's a specific interaction she has with him where she's like, look, like, you've lost sight, and I'm heavily paraphrasing, obviously, but you've lost sight of what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. You're weighed down by suffering, you're weighed down by loss, and you have to regain pleasure. You have to learn how to enjoy your existence again, and then remember why it is you're trying to get home in the first place, right? So she provides a sort of respite and a purification of Odysseus after so much suffering, right? So yeah, she definitely is this figure of healing through at least partially through pleasure, right? Certainly for Odysseus, it's healing through pleasure. And this came out very strongly when I contacted her, right? Part of what she wanted me to talk about was the healing powers of pleasure, and that enjoying yourself is good for your soul, right? That there's a sense in which, it's good for us to enjoy good things. Um, she, by the way, made very clear that she likes pretty good things, right? Like when I give her offerings, she likes them in crystal glasses. So there's that.
You outlined this process, and you've described these various characters. Um, if we go forward in through history, much closer to the modern day, but we go to Scott's discovery of witchcraft,
Mhm.
there is a specific cunning woman that you highlight named Mary Parish, and she has an alternative way of practicing this sort of necromancy, which is very similar to what you've been describing. It's not ceremonial style; it's very slow, organic, and it's like a how do I say? It's more of a natural process of coming into an understanding with the spirit of the dead. Um, and in fact, she makes her pact with the spirit of the dead that she works with before the person dies. So could you explain a little bit about this really wonderful historical character, Mary Parish?
Yeah, so the Scott and then the discovery of witchcraft and then Mary Parish as an example are one of the foundations for my whole approach in developing a necromantic assistant, right? Like building a relationship with the spirit of the dead who can help you out. In Scott, right? So in the discovery of witchcraft, there's an involved ritual. You can go to a grave, you can summon forth a sort of a spirit of the dead, and this is very sort of the Verum-ish approach, right? Where there's a contract, you get them to agree to the contract. And basically the idea, Scott mentions that the approach is to find someone who died of suicide or was executed, right? So in other words, you want someone who is not resting easy, someone who can benefit from your ministrations, right? So then you say, look, I'm going to go to mass and I'm going to pray for you and I'm going to do all these things, right? And as long as I do these things for you, you help me out, right? Okay. But Scott does mention the other option is to find someone who is going to be executed and to get them to agree to this process before they're executed, right? So that's sort of a another option. And this is the option that Mary Parish takes, right? So this is from the Magical Adventures of Mary Parish, if I remember the title right. So she was a cunning woman. She certainly read Scott. She had to have gotten this from the discovery of witchcraft. And she is in prison. She's in a debtor's prison, and she becomes good friends with this man. He probably fell in love with her. It seems pretty clear cut that he was fairly deeply in love with her. She's getting out of prison, and it turns out that he's in bigger trouble than just being in a debtor's prison. So he's about to be moved to a different situation where he will be put to death, and he has been informed of this. So she says, "Hey, all right, if you're afraid of the afterlife, if you're worried about your state, if your situation, let's form this agreement, right? After you are put to death, I will call forth your spirit and we can continue hanging out, right? You can be my ally. We can work together." And he agrees very happily. In fact, we have a letter he wrote to her where he says, like, "I never imagined that your knowledge and power would extend beyond the afterlife and beyond life into the afterlife. And I'm so pleased to learn these things," right? Okay. So he agrees. He is put to death. He's hung. And she, if I remember right, it's the day after his hanging, but I could have that wrong. She goes to an empty field, basically, where she can be alone, and she calls to a spirit, right? And there's not an involved ritual. She calls to a spirit. His spirit shows up. The first day, it can't talk, right? It has a very raspy voice. It was just hung. Um, it's tired, so she says, all right, go rest and we'll talk tomorrow, right? And from then they build an ongoing relationship, and she has an extensive career as a cunning woman, and she's got clients, and she's dealing a lot with the courts of the fairies, right? She deals with like the kings and queens of fairy, but he is almost perpetually her ambassador. So she sends him to like go talk to the fairies and bring them to her and all this stuff, right? So he is extensively used in this. And it's amazing because it is very ritual light. There's an agreement amongst good friends, and then after he dies, he returns as her sort of ally, right, amongst the dead. Um, it's interesting because no pact is needed there because they already know each other, they already like each other. He probably loves her, right? There's already such uh, a
Well,
bond
the
of
love
friendship.
between them is the pact, right?
Yeah, precisely,
Yeah.
right? And this informed heavily sort of my own approach and my own understanding of my approach as well, where, of course, most of us, hopefully, right, won't end up knowing and loving someone who's going to be executed, right? However, we can form relationships with the dead that are relationships of mutual care and concern, right? That are friendships, right? We can be good friends with spirits of the dead. So yeah, my whole approach that I mentioned in that last chapter for getting a necromantic assistant is based on the idea of how do you approach this, right? How do you find a spirit of the dead who's likely to be a friend? How do you become a friend, right? It's kind of, how to win friends and influence ghosts.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think with that, we'll draw our interview to a close. But before we do, for anybody who is really interested in learning more about the subject of necromancy and ancient Greek necromancy and magic, what kind of text would you recommend for people to get a more holistic understanding of this process? Something that would maybe like really complement your own work.
There's I'm hoping I'm remembering the first name right, but there's Ogden's book, right, on necromancy.
Daniel
In
Ogden.
yeah, Daniel. I was gonna say Daniel, yeah. So it's Daniel Ogden's book on necromancy, right? That's a great text, and it's very sort of useful and fascinating. He's not approaching it from the standpoint of a practitioner, right? But it is sort of a good scholastic source for sure. Um, beyond that. hmm, There are a few, but I'm not going to remember the exact titles and the authors sort of off the top of my head, so I don't want to sort of mis represent them, right? Um, there are a few works on like the wandering dead, the restless dead in ancient Greece and things like that can be useful. Certainly, looking into, for example, if you're curious about this perspective where the dead have real power, right? I mean, extensive power. You want to look into the dead in Rome, right? The manes, for example. My pronunciation, do not use that as a guide, right? I have no idea how to pronounce
Is it Manes? Manes?
it. Sounds
Yeah.
right to me. I mean, I usually mention this, but like I do know ancient Greek. I can translate ancient Greek. I know we're talking about the Romans now, but my pronunciation of ancient Greek is legendarily terrible, right? So I am not a one for pronunciation. But if you look into the Manes in Rome, it's fascinating, right? Because they were understood to have the power to like bring the city of Rome to ruin, right? To tear apart nations, right? So it's very, very interesting. So looking into things like that, I think would be interesting as well and useful for the audience. Can I talk about one more thing? There's one thing I wanted to mention earlier that I didn't get
Of
a chance
course.
to. So in the second half, right, of the book, I have a chapter on ancient cults of the dead. So I talk about ancestor worship, hero worship, and what's called tomb cult, right? But one thing I just want to mention is that there is this technology. So when I was mentioning how part of what I'm teaching at points is how to provoke a haunting, it's not as crazy as you might think, right? Because there is a technology for turning a haunting into a beneficial force, right? And there are so I've heard Al Cummins and Jesse Hathaway talk about this in terms of saints, right? That in a sense, what saints are dead folks who you won't stop bothering, right? So they're constantly being bothered, so they're very lively, they're very awake, they're very active, right? But the development of tomb cult, which it's a very technical, there's a lot of detail there, but all I'm going to say is this. A lot of tomb cults end up being developed because there is a grave that has been forgotten about and it gets disrupted, right? So like a road is being built and they build it through a grave and they're like, oh my gosh, right? We just, disrupted this grave that no one knew was there, right? And it's still a problem for us, right? I lived in Tampa at one point, and they were building a building in downtown, and they disrupted a massive burial ground from the Seminole Wars. Very dark, very disturbing, right? It was probably a Native American bodies, but that were put there by the American military, right? But anyway, disrupted graves. So what probably happened from this? This is partial speculation, but probably they provoked bad luck and a haunting, right? In other words, the person whose grave or the people, sometimes it's several whose grave they disrupted, started causing trouble, probably, right? So what's the response? You build an altar, you build a shrine, you build a space where people start giving offerings to these disruptive, angry ghosts, and the ghosts get less angry, right? In other words, they begin to calm down and they become a force of benefit. So people now know, oh, you go to that shrine has some like very lively dead, but they're lively dead who we've now feasted with and we've made friends with. And, now they're willing to help us. They're awake, they're active, but they're no longer angry. Right. So there is this sort of technology of having what I think, and I'm not the only one, but what chances are was disruptive, angry hauntings that then get transformed into, through cult activity, into a beneficial, powerful force. Right. And you find this in a lot of tomb cults.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've said this on the show before, but there's a shrine close to where I live called Tsubaki Jinja, and it was commonly known when I first arrived in this city about 17 years ago, 18 years ago now, that you should never go to this shrine if you had a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a husband or a wife or a partner, because the goddess of the shrine was jealous. So what they did was they wanted to open up a, a chapel there so that the people could get married, but nobody was going because they knew about this. The folk context of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
location was that if you go there, the goddess is jealous, and this is something that just like spontaneously arose in the community. It wasn't ever something that like any priest of the location had ever said. So they needed to find a practical solution. So what they did was they went up into the mountains. They found an old shrine that had been abandoned with a male god that hadn't been attended to for a very long time, and they had a whole ceremony of bringing the god down from the mountain into the city, into the shrine, and they had a big wedding ceremony in the chapel for the two gods. And now she's been pacified. She is no longer a jealous goddess. So now you can go with your partner, and there's no problem, and you can even get married there now. So it's a living tradition of it's not a ghost per se, it's a
yeah,
goddess, but when you understand what a god or a goddess is in a Japanese context, it's very different to what a Westerner would consider to be like a monotheistic god. it's
yeah, yeah,
it's more like she is a very powerful genus loci of this area, as
yeah.
opposed to like a universal goddess of a concept or something. But yeah, so you see the same sort of development of living practice playing out even in the modern day in Japan. So that
That's
when you
amazing. Yeah, I love that for sure.
yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, the idea of placating angry ghosts, I think, is also something that I've seen here too. There's very specifically altars that are set up in a Buddhist context. Uh, Death is very much the realm of Buddhism in Japan as opposed to Shinto. Shinto's more about uh, being born, um, and things you do in life. Um, but the Buddhists are the ones who will prepare the soul for the afterlife. And so I've seen similar situations where specific graveyards have been considered haunted, and they've set up areas within the gravesite to placate ghosts in that area. So yeah, you can easily draw parallels from ancient practices all the way through to the modern day, and
Yeah, yeah.
it's just really fascinating stuff. But yeah, Cadmus, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this subject. And for our listeners, is there anything else that you're working on now? Any new projects, or are you taking a well-deserved break?
So I'm gonna be at Sacred Space and Between the Worlds. It's a joint conference, so I'll be there presenting on epistemic evocation and necromancy, right? So I'll be talking about some of this stuff there. That's in February. It's in Baltimore. It's a in-person type thing. But yeah, in terms of future projects, I've got a project. I don't want to say too much about it, but dealing with the PGM. So
Oh,
I do have a future book that is going to be heavily PGM stuff, Greek magical papyri stuff for anyone who is not used to just PGM. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of work with the Greek magical papyri.
excellent. I always love that sort of stuff. So, Cadmus, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Your work is always so striking and powerful. I really can't recommend you any higher. Thank you so much for coming onto the show today to discuss your book. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope I wasn't too rambly, but I certainly enjoyed it. It was fun as always.
That was Cadmus, author of Learning from Legendary Practitioners, a necromantic journey into history, myth, and the practice of magic. Available now from Hadean Press. I must admit that since Al Cummings turned me on to Cadmus's writings a few years ago, I have found that he has had a significant influence on my personal understanding and approach to the art of necromancy, like no other author. Cadmus's work gives voice and structure to the animist in my heart. His most recent book is, in my opinion, one of the best single texts ever written on the subject. And for all of those listening who are interested in working with the dead, I simply cannot recommend it any higher. This may be my favourite book of the year. I especially enjoyed learning about the ancient myths of Circe, Medea, and Tiresias, and I found many parallels between Cadmus's work with his personal assistant and my own necromantic work with the tutelary shade of Katabasis. The nature of offerings or sacrifice as well was very important, and I hope that you found it as deeply enriching as I did. I found Cadmus's candor in regard to the manner he underwent this process of epistemic evocation to be especially unique in the history of necromantic writing, and I think this text should be recognised as necessary reading for the modern practitioner, no matter what background you come from. Once the interview was concluded, we both agreed that we could have continued talking about so many more subjects. So perhaps I will have him back on for a second part in the future. Despite the depth of detail that we spoke on, we only covered a few parts of his book, so I strongly encourage you to go and get the book and dig deep into it, and maybe even get the conversation started in our mutual shared spaces. For more of Cadmus, you can find his lectures available through the Salem Witch Fest website, as well as his book, True to the Earth, through abeautifulresistance.org. Links to both of these can be found in the description below. If you have listened this far, then thank you so much for your continued support for Hadean Press and our global authorship. Please leave us a comment below, like, share, and subscribe for more just like this in the future. Our December episode will see Brian Johnson return alongside Jose Leito to discuss their upcoming translation and commentary of Cypriani Magici Septem Hore Magicae, the 7 magic hours of Cyprian the Mage. In my own personal news, the second cycle of The Vault, a guide to the Grimorium Verum, is now open on Substack, and I have created a Discord for our community if you are interested in joining us there. You can learn more about this through the link below in the description. Thank you all for listening. I have been your host, Matt Hadfield, and I will see you all again in the next one.